9-year-old Pei Seung-ah was hit and killed by a drunk driver while on her way home. Her last phone call to her mother was to ask for 15 minutes more of playtime with her friends. The 66-year-old driver, for his part, was heavily intoxicated, having drunk 14 bottles of soju and beer with 8 people before getting behind the wheel. So why is drunk driving so prevalent in Korea? Is leniency for crimes committed under the influence of alcohol serving as a license for crime? And what should be done to firmly crack down on drunk driving and its deadly consequences? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today, we address the tragic repercussions of drunk driving and its rampant recurrence amid what some pundits say are ultimately lenient punishments that fail to root out this deadly practice. For more on this, I have Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung Hee University here in the studio. Professor Song, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I also have Professor Cho Hee-kyung at Hongik University live on the line. Professor Cho, it's lovely to speak with you again.
It's good to see you.
Right. Professor Song, how do you explain the prevalence of drunk driving here in Korea and its tragic consequences?
Well, it's undeniable that Koreans are drinkers. And there has been, unfortunately, a permissive culture where people regarded drinking as part of work, and they go driving as a part of work, and they drink, and then they got on the car. I think that old habits hasn't died. But as I saw the statistics, it's not just old-timers like me, but it seems like younger people having gotten into party situation and then get in the car, and it's just the same. I think that's part of it, and the permissive culture kind of transfers over to the legal restrictions. It's a little bit more permissible than is required, I think. So there has been a number of different factors. I think for a while, I thought having infrastructure like the night buses would alleviate people getting into their own cars. But it does help a little bit, but not as much. So there's a number of conditions that conspire to make Korea, unfortunately, very prone to drunk driving.
Right, really unfortunately, of course. Professor Cho, some pundits claim that our society's relative lenience with regard to crimes committed under the influence of alcohol may be the root of the problem. What do you say?
Well, certainly being under the influence of alcohol for other crimes has acted or has been taken into consideration as a mitigating factor rather than an aggravating factor for other crimes such as assault and battery or even manslaughter and murder. Because if you are acting under intoxication, one of the requirements of a crime, which is the mental element, that you had the intent to commit that crime, that can be essentially abrogated because you could claim that because of alcohol, you didn't know what you were doing or you didn't exactly know what you were doing. But with regard to drink and driving or driving under influence, intoxication is one of the elements of the crime itself. So that itself cannot be used as a mitigating factor. But for a very long time, the punishment that was meted out for drinking and driving was very light in comparison to other crimes and also in comparison to other countries. And as Professor Song mentioned, we do have a rather lax or lenient attitude towards, or used to at least, people drinking and driving, and that certainly contributed to the high incidence of drinking and driving. So for a long time, criminal law didn't really do its job when it came to drinking and driving, which was A, to punish the perpetrator, and B, to act as a deterrent. And it didn't really do a deterrent job very well.
And staying with that, Professor Song, could you walk us through the legal consequences that a drunk driver faces following a related accident, including the appeals process, which I understand leads to a reduced sentence?
Yeah, actually, that's part of the problem. But usually how it goes is that you have a BAC, which is a blood alcohol content, checked out by the police. And if it goes over 0.3, then you're getting into suspension territory, and 0.08, then it's a revocation. So once the police gets that record in the place, they are ready to revoke your license or to suspend your license and give you the notice. And you have a chance to appeal if you choose to. But if not, then either you pay fine or you get your administrative suspensions or revocation in place. As you mentioned, the administrative appeal is something of a mitigating or the tools that people can reduce their punishments. And disturbingly, there are a plethora of advertisement from those professionals saying that if you do this, then there is a higher chance that it will be reduced. Now, the key to have your punishment reduced is a sob story. You had to drive, your livelihood depends on it, and you don't have a prior offenses as much. So all kinds of sob stories that you can come up with, it seemed to work. And on that basis, there has been a kind of a general notion that, well, if you get into trouble, there are ways to maybe not get off scot-free, but at least reduced. So that kind of hopeful scenario for the offenders would not be a good incentive.
I see. And given this reality, Professor Cho, efforts to enhance the legal penalty of fatal accidents caused by drunk driving include the earlier passing of the Yoon Chang-ho Act by the Parliament. Now, before we move forward, Professor Cho, could you tell us a bit about this act and the Constitutional Court's ruling against it?
Yes, the law is actually named after late Yoon Chang-ho, who was another tragic victim of DUI offense. He was, at the time, a university student serving in the military, and he got hit by a drunk driver, a completely intoxicated driver, and he was in a coma for many days and unfortunately passed away and never woke up. And so the National Assembly passed two different amendments to two sets of laws, one to the road traffic law and also another one to special punishment for certain crimes act, which essentially made the standard of BAC or blood alcohol content level more strict. So previously you had to, I think, reach 0.05 to have your license suspended if you're caught drinking and driving, but it's now been lowered to 0.03. And also the punishment that's available for drinking and driving has been increased so that previously it was between above 1 year up to a maximum of X number of years. But now life sentence is available. And if you actually kill somebody as a result of drinking and driving, now the minimum is 5-year sentence. So the standards have been strengthened, but the problem is the Constitutional Court has actually found this Yoon Chang-ho law to be unconstitutional in two aspects. The first is that there is a provision in that law which made if you're caught twice drinking and driving, then that would actually merit aggravated punishment because you are a repeat offender. And the Constitutional Court found that that is against the Constitution because it doesn't place any limit as to how long the period could be. You could have committed a drink driving once in your 20s, 30 years ago, and now you are in your 50s and you've had clean record of driving, and you make a mistake or an error, and you're caught, drunk behind the wheel. And they said that's disproportionate, and it doesn't comply with the principle of punishment being relative to the crime. And so they've actually made further amendments to the law as a result.
I see. And Professor Song, what has been the impact of the Yoon Chang-ho Act on traffic accidents caused by drunk drivers while it was in effect?
Well, it was in effect, as Professor Cho mentioned, there was public awareness, kind of a wake-up call to a lot of people that drunk driving is a very serious offense. But because of the Constitutional Court revoking or overturning that aggravated punishment section. And the attention span for people in this kind of issue is rather short. So statistics show that the drunk driving accident has gone down a little bit after the passage of the law, but then it come back up. So the impact did not really last long. I think it has to do with the message that the Constitutional Court unfortunately gave, that this aggravated punishment is unconstitutional, and people took it as a permission to go ahead and drunk driving.
Right, unfortunately. Professor Cho, what efforts are being made to perhaps improve the Yoon Chang-ho Act, to perhaps deal with the unconstitutional element within it as dictated by the Constitutional Court?
So the second aspect that the court found unconstitutional was that the law didn't differentiate between how much the drivers had drunken. So it treated the same whether the driver had 0.5 blood alcohol level or 0.01 blood alcohol level. And so they actually passed some recent amendments to the law, which now distinguishes between different levels of alcohol content in your blood. So if it's now between 0.03 to 0.2%, then you get slightly lighter punishment, as opposed to if your alcohol level is more than 0.02%, then you get much higher punishment. And also, you can take into account your past drink driving record as long as it was within the last 10 years. And those amendments actually have come into force earlier this month, on the 4th of April, in fact. But the problem is, once that law was declared unconstitutional last year, what happened was there were all these retrials of previously convicted people for DUI, drinking, sort of driving under influence. And many of them got their sentences reduced as a result of the Constitutional Court's judgment. And so if you actually search for Yoon Chang-ho law, the very first entries that you get as a result of your search is all these lawyers advertising their services, how to get your sentence reduced or how to mitigate your offense.
Right, these are the sob stories that Professor Song was talking about.
Indeed, yes.
I see. Personally speaking, Professor Cho, what are your thoughts on the Yoon Chang-ho Act?
I think the law is actually heading in the right direction, and it's in the right spirit. But what it didn't do was to, because it was rushed, as most of our legislative activities, it was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to this kind of public outpouring of rage over this senseless, accident that tragically killed this young life. And so I think there was not enough thought that went into the law. And so it became a very blunt instrument rather than being more variated and a bit more sort of customized to what it actually needed to do. So as a tool, it was a very blunt tool rather than a more kind of refined tool.
Right, indeed. Professor Song, meanwhile, as part of efforts to protect children within school zones, there is the Minshik law that was enacted about 3 years ago, I believe. Could you tell us a bit about this particular law and its impact? I mean, how effective has it been thus far? Well,
children getting hit by a car at the school zone or the children protection zone is as shocking as it is for any situation like that. So I think that the impact is pretty wide, and because of the efforts by the victims' parents, actually they were saying that the car was speeding, which turned out that it was not. But still, that law woke up people's attention and the focus on protecting the children large enough that the law passed. And what it does is that it puts into some cautionary measures, like putting the sign in the school zone and reducing the speed of maximum speed to 30 kilometers. And also it goes to the aggravated punishment. So for the drivers, the first notion in looking at the law is that if you cause accident in any manner within the protect the children zone, then your life is screwed. So there was a scare factor at first, but as it turns out, it didn't really pan out that way. The punishment or the appeals overturns has been too frequent, disturbingly enough, so that the impact is not as big as the one we anticipated or wanted.
Right. Professor Cho, for the sake of comparison, what can you tell us about the legal consequences of driving under the influence in perhaps other countries?
Well, a lot of countries actually have much more strict standards and much harsher punishment than we do. For example, to take in the extremes first, China and Brazil actually have the death penalty available if you kill somebody while driving under influence. Other countries have 0% BAC, so meaning that they have absolutely no tolerance for anyone who's even drunken a drop of alcohol to be sitting behind the wheel. Some other countries take the naming and shaming approach, like Taiwan, where they disclose the identity of a drunk driver who has caused an accident that's injured people. There are many countries that actually have much lower blood alcohol level than we do, starting with 0.0% to 0.2%. And a little bit more sort of clever approach I found were examples like in Australia, where they differentiate among different levels of drivers. So if you are a learner driver or a novice driver, then there's no tolerance at all for alcohol. Your alcohol BAC is 0.0%, whereas if you have some years of experience, then that level gradually gets increased to 0.02 or 0.05. But if you are a driver of public transport or drivers with vehicles that carry dangerous goods, again, the blood alcohol level is limited. And so those are the kind of, I think, different approaches that we can look at to essentially have more variated response.
Right, I see. Professor Song, countries, including those in Europe as well as the US, have adopted the ignition interlock devices to discourage DUIs. Now, that being said, what is hindering the adoption of such technology here in South Korea?
Right, that's a case where the technology helps the situation. I mean, I'm looking forward to a ultimate situation where a self-guided car would make this kind of dispute pretty null.
I'll keep
but
my fingers
until
crossed
then,
for that, of course.
right? Until then, that's one of the ways to reduce this kind of tragic situations by using a added function to the car by putting essentially a breathalyzer in your car, and if your BAC goes over certain legal limits, then the car doesn't even start. Now, the thing is, the technology is here. Even it's not an imported technology. Korean companies have developed this technology, so we have that in place. And this law, a bill, has been introduced before, too. 2009, I think. It's been about 14 years, but no significant the progress has been made in terms of making into the law. I think there are many reasons. I think people are reluctant to do it. They're putting into all the cars out there. It's a very hard thing to do. But if you look at the US situation, they've been putting this kind of devices in certain select cars since 1986, I think. So US is, in total, they see the 19% or so of a reduction in the accidents. And prime, the example in that US scenario is Arizona, where they mandated this devices seven years ago. And their reduction rate is pretty remarkable, so more than 19%. So in terms of putting this technology into use, there's a proven record, and there's a a kind of a track record that we can count on. But I think that we have to go over the cultural barriers, people's resistance in making this kind of devices universal. I think it goes back to the cultural issues, people being too permissive in drinking and doing other things, including driving.
Right, and against this backdrop, Professor Cho, here's a difficult question. What do you propose to prevent drunk driving and its related fatalities here on the local front?
I think strengthening criminal punishment is not really the answer. What we need to do is make it socially unacceptable for people to drink and drive. It's a little bit like Kim Young-lan law, where small bribery used to be just accepted as something, as like a social lubricant, but now no longer really. And in the same way, I think we have to make it so that if you drink, then it's a complete social modification or an offense to be sitting behind the wheel. Car is a great machine that take us to places, but in the hands of a drunken person, it becomes a weapon that can kill people. And we know this, and we have tools to address them and to solve the issue, and yet we don't take them and implement them. And every single time when something like this kind of tragic accident happens, we beat our chest and we say we'll have to do better, we have to strengthen the punishment, etc. But unless we change our attitude towards drinking and driving, just lengthening the sentencing and so forth is not really going to make a big difference. And I think we really have to get them young so that when drivers initially start driving, we have to drill it into their heads that you must not touch alcohol and drive. That's not acceptable.
You're right. I suppose we need a social campaign as well then. Professor Song, what are your suggestions to combat DUIs?
Well, similar opinions, but I think it has to be a combination of different efforts going into place. Punishment is one thing. I think there has to be, in certain situations, zero tolerance, but for other things, it should be harder to overcome the initial conviction or the charges. But also cultural factors as well. I think there has to be a public education and awareness campaign. And also infrastructure, maybe more night buses so that people want to go out and party. Maybe it gets easier to do that. Right? But those kind of things alone cannot make this one go away. I think the technology is also part of it. So until we get to a point where either technology or others completely eradicate this kind of discussions, we have to put everything, every single efforts into place so that we can reduce more accidents going by, especially when it when it comes to the protection of children. I think there has to be a zero tolerance, and people has to know that aggravated punishment is apt and good punishment on that. And I think every parents in this country will agree on that.
Right, I would have to agree with you as well, to protect our children, of course. All right, Professor Song, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
My pleasure.
And Professor Cho, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have today. We return same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday, with a look back at Korea's road to democracy. Join us then.